Okay, welcome everyone to the Sierra Club Mayday and a Just Transition. We first have Larry Williams Jr., the Labor and Coal Coordinator with the Sierra Club. Then also David Van Duzen, the Vermont AFL-CIO. I just want to talk about some logistics here quickly. Just make sure your microphone is muted. If you have questions along the way, please put it in the chat box. We will try to read them, or we will unmute you the conversation to ask the question. You can raise the hand feature to alert us that you have a question or some relevant information. You can also share any relevant information in the chat box. You can also turn off your video camera while watching. However, if you talk, please turn your video camera back on. We are also recording the presentation and may rebroadcast this meeting at a later time. So at first, I want to actually just talk about the Sierra Club's in Vermont's recent history on labor issues. I've been with the Vermont chapter of the Sierra Club for about 6 years, but before that, I'm just going to reference that one of my predecessors with the Vermont chapter, David Van Duzen, got the Vermont chapter involved with the May Day rally and around particularly the healthcare as a human right campaign. So we were a big participant in that rally. I think about 8 years ago. In my time frame at the chapter, we actually got involved with the NAA's fight with the governor over teachers' health care and the rights of collective bargaining. So we actually sent a letter, and is actually one of the things that I find most remarkable is a letter I sent to all legislators on that particular issue was the most response I received by any legislator in my time frame. So it's something like, it shows like when we stand together with other groups, legislators respond in a different way because they're not used to hearing me talk about labor issues. We also have been actively involved with the Lieutenant Governor's office in holding what we were calling blue-green meetings here in Vermont to kind of get the relationships built between the labor community and some environmental groups. Last year as well, David Van Duzen with AFSCME organized a protest against Scott Walker when he came here to speak to the Republican governors, the Vermont governor Republicans with Governor Phil Scott. So we actually attended. I know Steve Crowley, who's on this video call with me, participated in with that. And then we're still actually even trying to do some more engagement around labor issues. And this year, I've been regularly attending the Labor Caucus, what's actually called the Working Vermonters Caucus, to kind of hear what the labor issues are out there. So we're trying to build those relationships so we can build one long movement. But I want to first lead it off with Larry Williams Jr. From the Sierra Club National to let him kind of talk about our relationship with the Sierra Club and how we've handled it on the national scene, particularly with the Blue-Green Alliance, and maybe even talking about the just transition. Larry, are you there ready to take over? There you are.
Rob, how much time do I have?
About 10 minutes.
Well, that's great. Thanks so much, everybody. I really appreciate you welcoming me onto your call today. I first want to say, Rob, it's really hilarious, that photo that you got there. It's if you asked me for a photo, I definitely would have sent you something different. That is, it brings back so many memories to see that moment. That was probably about almost 2 years ago at this point, when we were in collective bargaining with the Sierra Club, and I was president of PW at that time. And if you look at the photo, there was 2 laptops on my lap, which is, I guess, indicative of twice as much work. I don't know. Maybe I'm just like trying to multitask. But so I actually want to just start off by saying it's obviously clear that this is a very strange moment for our country. And I think particularly when it comes to workers, for the first time you see the conversation about frontline workers is at the front and center of the conversation, whether it's workers who are in healthcare, workers in the nurses unions, workers who are in grocery stores like UFCW, United Food Commercial Workers, workers who are bus drivers, Amalgamated Transit Union. These are folks who have forever been a part of the fabric of our economy, who are often invisible. And in this moment, we see that they are being impacted predominantly by what's happening. If you look at Tyson Foods, Smithfield Foods, if those plants shut down, it's likely that, you know, our food supply, particularly in terms of meat, which folks are varied on that issue anyway, are going to be impacted. If you're talking about workers in the oil industry, obviously, you know how we feel about the oil industry. Still, those are workers who have families. And so the perspective that we take in the Sierra Club as a whole, right, we all have our own opinions and different realities in our states. But just, you know, what I think the tacit agreement we've made about just transition is that communities and unions, workers have to decide what just transition looks like for them. So I'm not going to say today that, here, I have the exact plan of what just transition should look like for you, right? My job as labor coordinator with the Sierra Club means that I work really closely with lots of really great communities of Sierra Club chapters, volunteers, staff on figuring out how they can both engage labor unions, community organizations, EJ groups, and solar companies, for example, on how to create a plan for just transition. For those who are not familiar with the term just transition, it really came out of the oil and atomic and chemical workers union. There was a gentleman who believed that the industry of nuclear power was very, very much too dangerous for workers to be working in it. But he also wanted to make sure that his colleagues had a career. So the idea was that they should be able to justly transition to a different type of work. So I also want to acknowledge that a lot of times when you hear the term just transition, it can mean different things to different people. For folks in the environmental movement, it often means moving from an economy that's predominantly run by, you know, dirty fuels, fossil fuels, to an economy that's run by clean energy. But if you talk to somebody that's in a union who doesn't necessarily engage in justice work, they might feel like that means a fancy funeral for their job, that you're going to come in and shut down the plant and that they're not going to have work anymore. They're not going to have a tax base to care for their community. I think acknowledging each other's realities is really important. And the 5 years I've been working with Sierra Club, I've personally been changed and I've grown from all the conversations I've had with people who are in different parts of this economy. Now, where does that put us right now in this, I can't even say post-coronavirus because we're still fighting this, but in this current economy where we are looking at astronomical unemployment, earlier estimates put us at 32% unemployment. That's, you know, very close to the Great Depression. Obviously, we can only say that we're in, for sure, a recession, but we can't say we're in a depression because we haven't had 4 consecutive quarters of negative growth. But it's likely we're headed in that direction. You know, the Great Depression had 25% unemployment, 25% underemployment. You had people who were employed working 50, 60 hours a week, trying to keep their job. Labor unions played a very important role in that time, creating the Fair Labor Standards Act, obviously the National Labor Relations Act. There's a lot of things that came out of that era. The 1929 crash really started with Hoover, believing that this was mainly a problem of the market, and that we had to boost the market. Roosevelt coming in with a very different perspective, believing that we needed to create jobs. And that's the New Deal itself really shaped our economy, helped us get out of the Great Depression. So I just wanted to draw the similarities between that era and this era and say that just transition, while we've been talking about the concept, but well before this moment, I think it's a concept that uniquely applies to this moment because we have a conversation around how do we care for workers if they literally can't work? All of a sudden, conversations around universal basic income and things that sounded insane 2 months ago are now in the conversation. We're all getting $1,000 checks for what it's worth. So recognizing I'm coming to the end of my time, I think the main thing I want to do is just express the fact that Sierra Club at the national level has a lot of relationships, working relationships with unions. The main ways that we do that is, number one, through the Blue-Green Alliance. This is a coalition of unions and clean energy and climate groups. It was founded by Sierra Club and the Steelworkers in 2006. Since then, it's grown to include a lot of different powerful unions, particularly at the national level, but some at the state as well. Blue-Green Alliance exists more in some states than others. Our second relationship that's been blossoming is with the Labor Network for Sustainability that I sat on that group for a number of years. And it's a lot of local unions at the mid and lower levels of the labor movement, meaning locals, state feds, groups are a part of that. I'm willing to, have more conversations and share more about those types of relationships, but I also want to say, whatever the reality is in your state, in your community, you should know that other people are probably working to do something to push things forward as well. Rob and I have actually had conversations about the fact that a lot of the work that's being done in the labor movement, it needs to be combined with what's happening with the climate movement. And we have a unique opportunity as a Sierra Club to do a lot of that work. So I hope I've given a good explanation of the work that I do. If you have any questions, I wasn't going to be able to stay for the whole hour, but it looks like I have a little bit more time than I thought. So for the 15 minutes after, I'd love to answer some questions about the support we have for the labor movement and things like that, and whatever you need.
So thank you very much for that introductory remarks, Larry. Just in between this, before we go to our next speaker, I just want to put a quick little poll asking people if they are a union member or ever have been a union member. So just if you can hit your response very quickly, we just want to kind of gauge how many people here are. And then after 1 minute, after almost everybody enters, we can just kind of get a quick little gauge about this. But it looks like 40% of you are a union member, 2 with a previous employer, 4 of you not. And just to reference, for those who didn't realize, pick up on that, Sierra Club is unionized, and Larry was the former president of the Progressive Workers Union. And actually, recently the state chapters employees have become unionized, and we're in the process of bargaining on that. So I am a unionized as well, and I didn't enter in that poll. So Steve, can you take it on and do an introduction of?
Sure. Well, just real quickly, a big welcome to Dave Van Dusen. Dave is currently the director of the Vermont AFL-CIO. He's been a union activist and a member for many years. It's also worth pointing out that I don't know, about 10 years ago or so, Dave was Dave had Rob's job. Dave was our Sierra Club's organizer, and during that time we did a lot of work to. I think this probably took up most of your time, Dave. Was working with the people in the Abenaki group who were, and we assisted them in purchasing some land up in the Northeast Kingdom, which was the first time I think ever that they had been able to do that. And so that was a great experience. Our chapter actually earned a national award for our work with, at that time we talked about non-traditional allies. And a lot of that is due to Dave's perseverance and his capacity to reach out to those folks and made some great things happen. So we're very pleased to have him back here to talk about the labor perspective on just transition. Dave, welcome.
Thanks, Steve. It's good to be back. And Larry, thank you for that that grounding in history. That was really important. So as president of the Vermont AFL-CIO, we have 10,000 members around the state. Our leadership recognizes squarely that the way we win is going to be by creating those alliances, not just within the labor movement, but also within the environmental community and other communities that traditionally have not had close ties with the unions. So a central part of our platform is the advancement of a progressively funded union-based Green New Deal. Right now, this was a central part of what we were advocating for before COVID-19. But now with the absolute collapse of the economy, with the talk of a second Great Depression, talking about a New Deal, and specifically talking about a Green New Deal, is paramount in the way we're envisioning the period that will come after the immediate health crisis. I've spent a lot of time on the telephone and communicating with lawmakers from various parties in the last couple months and prior to that. And I'm concerned. I'm concerned that the response we saw in the downturn in 2008 is going to be what many from both the Republican and Democratic parties are going to be pushing for now here in Vermont, nationally, but also here in Vermont, where we're talking about cuts. And the code word for cuts to social programs, the code word for layoffs is going to be, we need to protect our most vulnerable, which is total BS. That's folks are going to be trying to make you feel good about doing less and continuing to give massive tax breaks to corporations and the wealthy. What we need to do is not less of something that was inadequate already, but we need massive public investment into construction projects specifically aimed at renewable energy production. This is what we need to do. And when we talk about a just transition, right now, you have to keep in mind that we have the 1,000 plus members of the Vermont Building Trades Council as part of the AFL-CIO on board with a Green New Deal. But what we need to see is not, as Larry put it, a funeral, a fancy funeral for the ending of good paying jobs. We need to see the ramping up of sustainable, good green energy production where our members are doing that work and are constructing those new projects that will bring us into a new renewable energy future. And we can't have it done as we saw in the past with the Sheffield and Lowell wind projects. We had, I believe, a grand total of 8 union jobs, 8 on those projects. Largely, it was out-of-state contractors coming in, paying folks iron worker jobs, paying iron workers $13 an hour with no benefits, staying at cheap motels while they were here to create those wind farms, which presently between two of them, one of you all know more than me, but I believe they generate electricity for over 20,000 homes. But we need these jobs to be good union jobs that are paying prevailing wages, that are providing healthcare and other benefits. And if we are committed to that, I don't mean we just the AFL-CIO, obviously we are, but if Vermonters are committed to seeing that through, this could be the future. This could be generations of jobs, good jobs right here in Vermont that not only provide a livelihood for hundreds of thousands, not just construction, but related industries too, but not only for the livelihood of our working people, but also could address the climate concerns that we have and reduce CO2 emissions and seek to have not just sustainable economy, but a sustainable planet. This is the project before us, but don't be fooled. Many of the folks that say they are your friends or say that they are our friends who are elected to the General Assembly, without a big push, without a concerted effort, without a united front, without a popular front, they are not going to do that. They might make some small nods in the direction of the environmental community, a few more charging stations for electric vehicles, which working people can't afford anyway. They may give a nod, throw a bone here and there to labor, but most of the people, the majority of the people up there have not shown themselves to be squarely dedicated to a serious rethink of the environment and the economy. But this tragedy, this crisis that we're dealing with now, in some regards, not to sound callous about it, but it's an opportunity. Just as folks are seeing that workers are essential, and many of them were low-paid workers to begin with in grocery stores, home healthcare providers, et cetera. But they're also now seeing not just how important we are, but how important it's going to be to reinvest, or a lot of Vermonters will, reinvest in our economy, make work programs like we saw during the first New Deal. This is the task before us today. But we cannot allow the narrative to be seized by those who would like to see cuts and to see a return or to status quo or even a diminishing of the status quo. And in order for us to get the traction we need, in order for us to make the progress we need to be fighting now, not tomorrow, not next January, but right now, every chance we get to stand on the mountaintops and scream that we need a Green New Deal. We want to be partners with groups such as the Sierra Club on this. We want to be partners with 350.org, Extinction Rebellion, other environmental organizations. We know that we are stronger together. When we are divided, that is when we will be defeated by the forces of the status quo. So I very much appreciate being invited back to talk with the Sierra Club. We want to develop a long-term relationship with you all. We recognize that there are going to be times where both of our organizations and our memberships will be asked to go outside their comfort zone. For many of our folks already for us to put an emphasis on climate issues, which we have done, that's a bit of a stretch from what they're previously used to. And perhaps for a number of your members, talking about class issues, talking about what it means to be working class and why these issues of economics are so important to us may also be outside of many of your members' comfort zones as well. But united, we have a chance of winning. Divided, we do not have a chance of winning. So that's what makes this conversation today so crucial. I would also like to point out that on May 1st, in Burlington and in places around the state, there is going to be large demonstrations that will be based in people driving in car caravans in support of essential workers. I would very much encourage you or ask you to consider attending that and to going. You could find more information on that by reaching out to Migrant Justice, which is an organization of undocumented, largely, not all, but largely undocumented. And they are strong allies. We are strong allies with them. And we are standing by Migrant Justice as well as the AFL-CIO, demanding that all benefits being provided during the crisis to documented workers also be provided to our essential farm workers who, regardless of their immigration status.
Terrific. Thank you, David. It's a great statement. I have a quick question, then we'll maybe go to Jack, but a quick question would be, in Vermont, you were talking about the Green New Deal as an opportunity,
Yes.
and we all know about the Green New Deal that's supported by Sunrise and AOC in Congress. We also have a Green Mountain Green New Deal, which is somewhat different from that. And perhaps doesn't address a lot of the issues that you're raising. What's your feeling about that? Do you feel it's a good starting point, or it's
a starting point
about that?
So we're a firm supporter of Anthony Polina's Green Mountain New Deal bill. In fact, I was on a telephone call with a different senator today, and we were talking in part about that bill. It is simply a starting point that in no way should be viewed as a beginning and end of anything. But to recapture some of the gross amounts of money that the wealthiest Vermonters retained through the Trump tax cuts and investing that in green initiatives and those that could support jobs as well, such as insulating homes, that's a good small first step. We need to go much bigger. Senator Bray, who I was talking to today, he was floating the idea of seeking legislation perhaps to sell freedom and unity bonds, where people could invest, regular working people for a modest amount of money could invest in Vermont, and those funds could be used for such projects as we're talking about now, green projects, projects that will seek to create jobs with this massive unemployment we're facing now. That strikes me as a great idea. We have to think outside of the box, and we have to look at every possible way to generate revenue that is progressive and which is not simply seeking to squeeze more out of a stone that doesn't have much to begin with. I mean, we really need to be looking at the corporations, and we need to be looking at the wealthiest of Vermonters. So the Polina bill is a good bill. We support it 100%. I believe you all support it too. That's just a start. We need to go about 1 million times further in that if we're going to emerge from this corona crisis in a stronger place economically and environmentally than we are today.
Great, thanks. We'll go to Jack, and so to everybody who's online here, we welcome your input, your questions, your comments. If you do have a question, as Rob said, there is a hand raising opportunity there someplace, and if you want to just say in the chat box that you have a question, we will get to you. If you want to type out your question, that's great too. Jack.
Just hold on one second. I just
Rob?
want to remind everybody that we did a conversation with Senator Anthony Polina 3 weeks ago, and if anybody wants a copy of that video, email me, and I'll send you a copy of that video at rob.kidd@sierraclub.org. So, okay, Jack, go.
So I'm Jack Cushman. Thank you, Larry and Dave, both for spending your time with us. I myself have been learning an awful lot from these conversations. I'm going to start with a question for Larry, just because I noticed, I think, that you are involved in the Sierra Club's coal campaign as well as its work with labor. And I remember thinking a couple of weeks ago when West Virginia was the last state that was going to report a case of the coronavirus. And I thought, well, first of all, that can't possibly be. They've got to have this virus in West Virginia already. But I also remember thinking, those workers from the coal mines who, worked in the 60s and 70s under inadequate OSHA standards and have black lung, they're going to get nailed awfully hard by the coronavirus. Do you know if that has been happening? And do you have any other experience? You mentioned the meat packers. That's an excellent example. Of course, the healthcare workers and people, from those unions. But are you finding that the virus is in any way galvanizing environmental and climate issues and health issues? Because these two concerns of public health and environmental protection are like bread and butter of the labor union for a long time. Is this coalescing at all, do you think?
Wow. Well, first I want to say thank you for asking that question, and I'm sure David's going to want to jump in here as well.
Yes, please, yeah.
I'll just say that, I did see something as well about the first case of coronavirus that was officially reported, that this woman really had to fight to get her husband treatment, to be able to get his actual case to be tested. And really, because of politics, she showed up at the hospital, really begged for them to take a look at him, refused, finally took his test when they saw that he was in really bad condition, lost his test, and then, came back and, because of political pressure, finally, tested him and found out both him and his wife both had coronavirus. I believe that was in West Virginia, actually. But I think, it's really sad that a situation like this with the pandemic gets mixed in with politics when we're all in crisis mode. And I think that that's really scary. I do think that, first of all, I did take a few notes here I want to make sure I share with you. So frontline unions are actually doing quite a bit of things in terms of fighting for sick leave, protections for workers, and masks. That leaks over to, fighting for OSHA regulations and safe workplace regulations. And at the national level, we've done quite a bit in terms of sign-on letters and things like that. The future battles are going to be, some of what David was mentioning, where the tax dollars are going to go to support state and local governments, how we're going to offset budget shorts, and also stabilize state budgets. So fighting for money for public employees, I see that there was a comment in the chat box about bailing out oil companies. And I got to say, it's fair to assume that if there's a bailout happening, workers are always going to be the last ones who are considered in doing that. So unless we get a part of that conversation and make sure workers are at the forefront of that conversation, it's not going to happen. I also want to say the job losses, furloughs, things like that. That's really, from what I hear, I don't want to speak for labor. I think David can do a better job with that. But I will say that I think at the forefront of most of those unions who are in that battle are focusing on that right now. But one thing I will tell folks that really, really surprised me, I saw an article that there's research being done in Italy right now that apparently areas that had higher levels of carbon in the air and particulate matter were vulnerable to the coronavirus traveling longer distances, which means that if you live in a polluted area, an environmental justice community, you are triple impacted by this thing. So this is just the first, everything we keep hearing different stories every week and things that kind of like, wow, is that real? But I think, we're going to hear a lot more stuff like this that are very clear combinations between why this is an environmental justice issue and a labor issue.
Yeah, well said. So that makes me think of another thing. Since you touched on some labor, maybe I'll touch on a little environmentalism. So just as the reactionaries in the world, the forces of the status quo, are going to seek to use this crisis not as a way to reform society in the way that perhaps some of us like to see, they're going to try to use it to claw away the gains that we've previously made, both economically, but also environmentally. Watch for the Trump administration to start talking about how they need to get rid of or suspend environmental regulations to get the economy rolling again. So there's a danger here to both of us. And when I say there's an opportunity for a Green New Deal, we also soberly recognize that that's a battle that has not been won. In times of economic crisis and social crisis, the left, generally speaking, what we may refer to the left-leaning forces, don't always win. So the winner of this struggle is going to be decided by people like us and our organizations. So where we perhaps might have some minor disagreements about any given issue, now is the time to find where there's the common ground and to push strong for a counter reaction to what is definitely going to be coming. And as far as health effects go, too, we've been lucky so far. I think that we've done a good job in Vermont with our social distancing and limiting the spread of the virus to a certain extent. But we do not have, while we don't have coal plants here, we do have granite sheds. And historically, workers in the granite industry also suffer from lung ailments as well. So I'm pleased that, to my knowledge so far, I have not heard of cases of the coronavirus spreading with our friends from the United Steelworkers who work in the granite sheds in Barrie. But these are things to be careful about. These are things to be cognizant of. And class and, frankly, race, all of these things are going to play a big role when the dust settles of who has suffered the most during this crisis. So this crisis is not only presenting challenges to us, but it's also revealing the shortcomings of our society as they were in place already. The fact that we don't have universal health care, the fact that we have poor communities with more pollution in the air that perhaps spreads the virus further, and that poor and working people are the ones that suffer from that. I mean, this is laying bare the contradictions of our contemporary society.
Thank you, Larry and David, for that question. I just actually want to call in Jared Duvall in here. Oh, actually, I feel like people are going to feel like I'm stacking it with Sierra Club people, because Jared Duvall, by happenstance, used to be the director of the Sierra Club Student Coalition many years ago, but now he's currently the executive director of the Vermont Energy Action Network. So Jared typed in a question. I'm going to let you ask that question. So go with it, Jared.
Thanks, Rob. And I've got R2D2 here with me, who just got out of his bath. So, this is webinars in the era of COVID. But first, I just want to thank you, Rob, and anyone else from the Sierra Club who's involved in organizing this. This is such a timely, important, and valuable conversation. And thanks so much to Larry and David for sharing your experience and expertise and reflections. And I asked it in the chat, but I've been seeing a number of articles in national media over the past few days. It's an idea that I haven't really heard of before, and I'm wondering, given your work in the labor and environmental community focused on a just transition, really directly, if you've either heard about this possibility or have just initial reflections on it, even if it is a newer idea of instead, of course, I heard yesterday from folks on Senator Sanders' staff that they'd seen analysis that the largest amount of lobbying dollars spent in the last month, kind of the post-COVID period, is from the oil and gas industry, who are asking and pushing for a bailout. And of course, we know that they were already over-leveraged and had significant structural problems already. And so this idea that it says some climate advocates are putting out there of no, of course, we're not going to talk about a bailout, but the idea of, buying out and publicly owning the oil and gas industry to drive down emissions and do more to ensure a just transition. I'm just curious if you've looked at that before, what your reaction to it is, what you see as some of the either pros and cons of it, or some of the just key considerations that if that idea gets further developed, what you would look for.
Well, Well, go ahead, Larry, if you want to go first.
No, you can go first. Go for it.
All right. Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. I thought you were going to go in a different direction. I know that some environmental advocates has said there should be strings attached to bailouts where over a period of time you reduce emissions. I was on a radio interview recently where they posed that question to me, and I said that that's a lot like putting a new coat of paint on an old car. I would rather see nationalization of industries where we don't have to beg or push them to do something better and more sustainable, where we could publicly own it. We could democratize the process, bring the unions into the decision-making processes, and actually do right. So I couldn't agree with you more. And to be clear, sometimes I think this is probably the same in most dynamics between environmental and labor. There's going to be times where there may be some disagreements. In Vermont, we have several hundred, frankly, good-paying union jobs on Vermont gas, on that pipeline. And I know that's something that a lot of environmental folks are not comfortable with. Yeah, I think we should nationalize them. And I think that to every extent possible, we could improve their commitment to an environmental transition and also to worker safety and worker pay in the process of doing that. Remember that under Obama, we nationalized the car industries. And the crazy thing to me, in some ways that was the right thing to do at the time. But the crazy thing to me is once they became solvent and started generating serious revenue, then we essentially gave them back. Why would we do that when we could have used that revenue to put it into environmental programs, into other programs that would create good paying jobs in the United States? Why would you, that boggles my mind. So we shouldn't create that mistake again. We should nationalize industries that require bailouts, and then we should use them for public good.
Wow, that was really great, David. You're like a mind reader. Maybe we should do this together more often.
Right on, man.
I was definitely gonna bring up the Obama administration nationalization strategy, and I think the other part of the answer that I was gonna give, because I think this is a really great question. I think philosophically, when you think about where the United States is politically, this is without going too far into politics, but just considering when you think about what Europe has, you have these companies where you have workers on the board of companies. When you ask a question like this, I'm always asking who's the president at the time, who's in Congress at the time, because that's going to really determine what the makeup of that plan is and how the plan ends up coming out on the back end. The Shock Doctrine is a book that I really recommend folks go back and visit, because this is a moment where we have a real crisis, and folks on the other side who are not thinking about the environment are definitely looking to exploit this moment to for gain. While we're all in panic mode and trying to kind of catch our breath, they're already thinking about what is the next way to kind of squeeze capital and do that reverse nationalization where we end up saving billionaires, right? I think that if we can get ourselves together to think strategically as an environmental labor movement, how do we, focus not only on the environment, but on the futures of working people, then something like what you're talking about makes a lot more sense. The problem, I think, though, is that folks are thinking about the short-term economy. If you look at the conversation happening nationally, it's like, how are we going to get the stock market back up or whatever, right? It's not really about what's happening in everyday life. Even the conversation around jobs is not really considering the long-term implication for gig workers and so many other workers. So I really love that you brought this into the discussion, and I think that it's something that should be considered, but also, regardless of who's president next time, we need to be talking to them now about our expectations, because the labor movement really hasn't made any gains since 1935 legislatively, the National Labor Relations Act. And everything that we really accomplished during the Obama era is now being pulled back as well. So I love this idea, and I know we want the world to be in better, so R2D2 over there can grow up with some clean air.
If I can just chime in a little bit, and without pretending like I have the answers to these questions, which I really don't, but it's such a fascinating discussion. One of the things that I'm going to be keeping my eye on is whether in this deregulatory rush and this oil industry bailout that we can see coming, one of the things that might happen is to push through, after all these years, the Keystone Pipeline, the KXL pipeline. If that happens, that's a 2-season building project out in that area. If that happens, it's going to happen by workers who are trucked in and housed in man camps and barracks and man camps. And then they're going to have a job. It's going to be a short time job. It's a 1-season job for most of them. Then they have no job. And that's going to be one of the most dangerous jobs in the country. It's going to be more dangerous than working on a fishing boat. It's going to be more dangerous than working in a coal mine, because that virus is going to be in those man camps. And so it just really troubles me to see this this vortex of possibilities as we scramble, and people do strange things under duress. The other thing is, you were talking about the evolution of labor laws, but one of the things I was so fascinated to learn about in the Green New Deal, how the utility industry was reshaped, and in the original New Deal, in the original FDR New Deal. When he came into office, one of the first things he had to do was to bust up the trust that owned all the electric utilities in the country. At a time, remember, when most people, especially most poor people, didn't have electricity. And so he was going to go and bust those trusts up. There was a huge fight about that. And in that fight, the corporate interests and the trust interests barraged Congress. And they created a conspiracy of what we would now call fake news, letters to members of Congress signed by hundreds of thousands of people who didn't exist. And just by a squeaker, the Senate had an investigating committee that sued these big electric companies for all their paperwork. And they proved the existence of this denial campaign, this fake campaign. And it was a huge scandal. And they won that vote to bust up those trusts by 1 vote in the Senate. So it's an example of needing to remember to hold the corporate interests to account. I come from a world of accountability journalism, and it's very hard as a journalist to take on a corporate entity. It's hard as a worker in a labor union to take on an entity as powerful as, say, Exxon Corporation. But if you're going to work the climate problem, it just seems to me you got to be willing to fight that fight and to recognize that it is a fight, it's a struggle, and that's what's going to be happening on the Keystone Line. I'm sorry, I've spoken over my time, but I feel very strongly about this as a Sierra Club member, and when I was working, I was a union member until they took it away from me.
A response from David or Larry to that? We have another question waiting.
Yeah, no, I think that he expressed himself well. Why don't we, I know we're limited on time, so why don't we go to another question?
Okay, so Richard Butts has a question. Richard, you're on. There we go. I think I've got you off mute.
Okay. First of all, I'm really pleased to attend this this talk, and particularly to see that Larry and Dave are coming together in something that I think is going to be really important, and that is the melding of labor and the Greens, so to speak, because as you've already said, this has not always been the case, and I've often felt that the environmental community has really done a lousy job talking to the labor community about how we can parallel our interests. Anyway, I'm really representing the Vermont Interfaith Power and Light. A lot of faith communities are trying to figure out what it is we can do. We went to Montpelier and we lobbied for the passage of the Global Climate Solutions Act. and had a great time doing that. And it was really energizing. But right now, if I were to go back to the rest of the board members and say, here are some priorities. Here are some things we really need to be focusing on. Larry and Dave, what would you advise?
Want me to go first, David?
Yeah, go ahead, man.
Okay. So I really I think that my mind automatically goes back to instances where I've worked with folks in the faith community. Personally, I was raised in a Christian church, so my father was a minister who ministered to folks in prison. So I definitely understand wanting to connect those two worlds, and the economic justice world and climate justice world with the faith world, right?
Yeah.
One of the greatest examples I've seen, gentlemen that work with us in Illinois, we did what's called the Future Energy Jobs Act. And the idea was, how do we bring clean energy companies, labor unions, environmental organizations like Sierra Club, and faith community together to try to create jobs for folks who wouldn't usually be having those opportunities. I'm talking about folks who have been in prison, folks who are returning citizens, the Latino community, Black community, folks that are usually overlooked for positions who have been traditionally excluded from the labor movement. And this brother named Reverend Pierce always got on the call and had really, really great points about how returning citizens have a lot more issues besides just needing the job. They may have substance abuse problems. They may have a problem getting a license so they can get to the workplace. In terms of math skills, things that folks wouldn't necessarily think of, even if you want to hire somebody who's in that position. Mm-hmm. So he helped us figure out the question of pre-apprenticeships to get folks ready for the actual apprenticeship, and then the labor unions like IBEW helped us think through, how do we get training for those folks so that they're not just getting a job, but they're getting a career. So when that specific job may end, they have skills that they can use for life. The idea that David brought up of project labor agreements, community benefits agreements, these things are super crucial for creating workforces that are sustainable over the long run. And I think coming out of this pandemic, whether it happens at the end of this year or next year, is going to be super crucial, because folks are going to be really desperate for work. And now you have workers competing each other for scraps. And we should say, if we're creating jobs, they shouldn't just be low-wage jobs. Right. They should be family-sustaining jobs that pay folks great wages. The thing that faith community can do that other folks can't do is bring out the moral reasoning why it's important to treat people good in a society. And I feel like that's the thing that's completely been lost. When Dr. King was killed, he was at a sanitation workers' strike in Memphis, Tennessee, and he was helping those workers with the famous "I am a man" signs. He was there because a man was crushed in a garbage truck, and so they just wanted basic things like the right to survive in the workplace. So I just wanted to underline the importance of the faith community in these conversations. There's definitely a place, whether it's coordinating people who wouldn't normally come together, or creating a safe space in a church, providing space for people to do that organizing. I think you are very, very, very key and crucial. David may have some more specific things to talk about in terms of priorities.
Yeah, well said. And thank you for bringing up and reminding us how Dr. King was in Memphis supporting the AFSCME strike at the time. I mean, that's huge. So specifically in Vermont, perhaps where we need to be going now with the faith community, with all of our communities, is yes, making that moral argument that coming out of this crisis, we're going to need massive public investment to bridge the gap to the environmental community. Perhaps that public investment will be on environmental projects or renewable energy projects. Then the job aspect of that is those need to be prevailing wage jobs. Yeah. Those need to be union jobs. And in places where a non-union employer comes in and benefits from public money, we need something in place. We need Vermont to start thinking about, they call it in California, labor peace agreements. I would call it a labor progress agreement, where a private employer would be required to have an agreement for something like card check, a way to get union recognition, if when their workers choose to unionize. So these are the type of things we need to be making a moral argument now. But we can't wait. We need to be writing letters of paper. We need to be making these arguments in op-eds in every creative way we can. Because if we allow the reactionaries or the forces of the status quo to seize the narrative, then we're going to be playing catch up for the next 2 years. And we need to advance to the offensive if we're going to have a shot at winning this.
So actually, just a question for either Dave or Larry. Are you two either familiar with the People's Bailout? Or do you have any expertise about following that? Sierra Club signed on to it, so.
Well, I don't know if we're speaking about the same thing, but I was on the RAD organized, Rights and Democracy organized, a People's Bailout call the other day with the public involved, with the head of the Vermont Senate and House and the Lieutenant Governor. So if we're talking about the Rights and Democracy Initiative, to a certain extent, yes, but one of the challenges we have, and we have to get beyond this very quickly, is we have a dozen or so organizations all basically advocating for something similar, but we have not yet, and we need to, created a popular front-like structure to allow us to not replicate each other's work. So that's part of community solidarity. That's something that we need to very quickly be moving in the direction towards, be it the Sierra Club, 350, Rights and Democracy, the AFL-CIO, the United Electrical Workers, et cetera.
So Dave, there actually is a People's Bailout nationally that that Sierra Club had signed on to with a whole line of other social justice organizations. Larry, I was wondering if you knew anything about that, a little bit more detail.
I have heard about it, but I haven't been deeply involved in it. I mean, overall, I do think that it lines up with what we've been pushing, is that, you know, workers should be at the forefront of the conversation, particularly at this moment, but I don't know as much about it.
Okay.
We're getting pretty close to the end of our time here. One thing I would bring up is that, you know, I think it's useful in my thinking about all this and the whole concept of a just transition, perhaps in Vermont, where we don't have that many frontline, you know, coal miners and oil company workers or nuclear workers. That's not here. But we see a need to transition to a whole new kind of economy, a whole new green energy economy that's structured differently than what we've known before. Even the physical structures that get built with it, let alone the kinds of companies and workforce that go along with it, are going to be different. They're going to be distributed across the landscape, and we're rethinking the grid and all those things that we're rethinking everything, transportation, heating. And it always strikes me that to enable that kind of thing, there's some of the basic supports for society that have come through those large employers that may be falling by the wayside. Things like healthcare and things like you know, family supports, and many of the things that have been on the table in the Vermont legislature. All those things that we have come about because of a history of labor action. They didn't come about because people just all of a sudden thought it'd be a great idea for everybody. They to the extent that we have those embedded in our culture, it's because of labor action. And I think it's going to be a crucial element of where we turn to next for our green economy. So, you know, we've got to figure that out. I think that priorities question and everything we've talked about fit right into that, because if you don't have a just economy, you don't have a sustainable economy. So, David and Larry, do you have any closing comments?
You want to tackle that first, Larry? You got in?
Sure, I'll take the lead first. I think the main thing I want to say for folks who are just starting their engagement, with the local labor group or trying to figure out how they can work together. Again, remember that you're not the first person doing this work. There are folks that you can reach out to. You can reach out to us in the labor program. Rob has great connects. And Richard, I wanted to point out that there's a great coalition in Connecticut called the Connecticut Roundtable on Jobs. I believe there's some faith-based groups there. And if you have Rob connect us, I can, connect you with the executive director of that group. But, it took a many years for me to fully understand, I think, the depth and scope of the problem. And I think we all have to continue to try to push forward and understand that, maybe our perspective isn't the only perspective, right? And that, even though when you first initially approach someone to talk about this stuff, it may feel over their head because they're not used to talking about environmental stuff. Likewise, if they talk to you about a labor contract or a project labor agreement, you feel like, whoa, I don't know what this is, but that's the beautiful part about it. And that's why it's so powerful when we team up with folks in the labor movement to have David a part of this conversation, is because that is the double whammy that industry's not ready for. They're not ready for to not be able to bring a bunch of workers there and play them against you. Now, when the workers are saying we want clean air and we want a good, sustainable job, that's a powerful team.
Agreed, 100%. So for everybody on this call today, and when you talk with your family and your friends, I can't stress enough that we are at a critical juncture of our history as Vermonters, as Americans, and as world citizens. This time and how we deal with this crisis coming out of it is going to define who we are, for better or worse, as a people for generations to come. We cannot wait for elected officials or for those that you're used to seeing on the television to take the lead. We need to set the narrative now. We need to be talking about a popular front, a Green New Deal, and we need to form those alliances and go beyond our comfort zone in order to grow our power into something that the status quo will not be able to resist. This is the struggle facing us in our time. And this is the task given to both the Sierra Club and to the AFL-CIO. So I look forward to working with you all to try to forge that partnership and to build that power going forward.
Thank you very much, Dave and Larry, for the discussion tonight. I just want to actually point up onto the screen a couple extra resources that there are related towards this. I referenced the People's Bailout, which talks about a lot of the principles on there. And then they actually links to the May Day rallies through the People's Bailout.org, links to the different May Day rallies, including Fridays with that Dave was talking about. And also I gave the link to the Blue Green Alliance there. And then here's actually just another poster about the march on the car rally. Just to note, the Sierra Club is not participating in it because there's some questions about our safety and about participating in it. But we support the concept of it, so it's a good event for those to walk along down different issues in tandem. Just wanted to give another plug for our next couple conversations. Jared Duvall, the executive director of the Vermont Energy Action Network, who actually asked that really good question before, is going to be talking next week. And then we have a whole line of other conversations, including about the future of public transit, environmental health and disparities in the context of environmental justice, and the mega dam and mega damage issue, which actually has a lot of environmental justice issues connected with that. So please join us for those conversations at 7 o'clock. And then that is going to actually close up this. So thank you all for participating. Thank you, Larry, and thank you, Dave, for joining the conversation.